I was talking with Andrew at lunch, and I told him there are times when I'm tempted to just say a name, especially one of these Old Testament names we don't talk about a lot, just completely and totally wrong, and start making y'all question whether or not you said it wrong your whole life kind of thing, you know. When I look at some of these Old Testament passages or some of these Old Testament books, it's a little bit strange, some of the names or some of the words that are used, and they always tell us in school, if you have no idea what to say as far as pronouncing a name correctly, say it with confidence and everyone else will begin to doubt whether they've been saying it right. It is Habakkuk, okay? So if you say Habakkuk, you said it right. If you say anything else, sorry, but you're wrong. There are a few things about Habakkuk that are interesting. Okay, now Habakkuk was written in the time period from around 540 to around 615 BC. Okay, that's a pretty big window. But in that time period, you see this moment in which God is going to use a nation that is very evil and wicked to do His will. And there's one really main theme or thought process throughout the book of Habakkuk, and that is, how can God, who is loving, nurturing, graceful, merciful, all-powerful, and just and good, use somebody so evil and wicked to do His will? Now, the strange thing about this is not the last time that this question will ever be asked. There are times throughout Scripture where God uses somebody who we might not typically would think would be chosen to do His will, we think about maybe some of the evil people who have gone before. God even used the pharaohs, some of which would be evil. God used kings whose hearts were hardened or evil or wicked. And yet He uses these people to do His will and do good things, which leads sometimes to the question being posed by those who are faithful. How can God use someone who is so evil and wicked, in this instance, someone like Babylon, to do something that is a part of God's will? Now, here's something that is interesting about this. God used Assyria, the nation of Assyria, to punish the people of Israel because of their lack of obedience to God. And then, now they're going to use Babylon to punish Assyria. So God used the Assyrians to punish the Israelites for their disobedience, and now He's going to use the nation of Babylon to punish the Assyrians for their evil and wickedness. And then guess what's going to happen to Babylon? Well, there's going to be a nation who is going to even stand against Babylon and punish Babylon as well. Now, that will not occur until about 539 at the hands of Persia. So you've got this domino effect almost. Israel's disobedience is punished by the Assyrian nation. Assyria is evil and wicked, and they're punished by the Babylonians. The Babylonians, guess what? Evil and wicked, and therefore they would be punished by the Persians. You can only take a shot in the dark as to what happens to the Persians. Once again, it's this cycle, this moment. But what this causes is a great question to arise within the people of Israel, especially within the writings of the prophet here. So let's look here. It says, the oracle of Habakkuk, this is beginning in verse 1. The oracle of Habakkuk, the prophet, saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. What we're going to see here is very similar to what we see in other passages in Scripture about complaining and about some complaints that are being offered up unto the Father. And the problem that Habakkuk is saying is, he says, how long am I going to have to cry out to God before God does something? How long am I going to have to say cry out violence before anything is done about that violence? How long are you going to look at iniquity and allow for it to occur? Now, here's the interesting part about it. You're going to see a conversation, especially within the first 2 chapters here. You're going to see 2 chapters of, or part of chapter 2, I guess, of conversation between Habakkuk and the people of God and God. They make a complaint. They reach out, they say something's going wrong, you're not doing something right, which is kind of bold on their part to tell God that He's not doing something right. And then you're going to see God's response. So after they make mention, or after he makes mention of this idea of the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. He makes mention, or is responded to with verse 5. Look among the nations and see wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, the bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth, to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like eagles, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. So you got this complaint being offered forward by the people of God. God, why are you going to sit around and allow for this evil and wicked violence to happen? You're going to sit around and allow for iniquity to run rampant. Why aren't you doing anything? Okay, here's God's response. You don't know anything. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what I've got preparing. And then he makes mention of this group of Chaldeans, and how their horses are faster than leopards, and how their minds are solely focused on moving forward, and their chariots swoop down like an eagle after its prey and devour everything that stands before it. They laugh at kings. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at rulers. They laugh at every fortress. They pile up everything on earth, and they take it. They sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose might is their God. He's saying justice is coming. But yet, you're too blinded to the fact because you don't know what's going on. You know, when we look at these moments where Israel has their shortcomings, you can just about narrow it down to a lack of faith. I mean, that's a very oversimplification of what's going on with the nation of Israel, but a lack of faith. And that's exactly what's being stated here. You don't know what is going on. And so you stand up and you say something, and you say it boldly or loudly, or you say it directly to me in an accusatory way, and yet you have no idea what I have in the works. This reminds me of maybe a man like Job, who questions God about, why this, why that, and why that, and what is his response to Job? Job, you know nothing. You're but a speck. Were you there in the beginning of time? Will you be there in the end? Were you there when I formed the worlds and divided the seas from the land? Were you there when I caused there to be a light and a darkness? Were you there when I did all these things? And of course, Job's response had to be no, because he wasn't. He was reminding him, Job, some things aren't meant for you to know. Some things are meant for you to rely on faith. The Israelites were having a lack of faith, and they weren't understanding that God was in control because they couldn't physically see it at that moment. And as a result, they questioned whether or not God is even present. Sound familiar to anything that we might face today? People face times of turmoil, times of distress, times when things seem to not be going as well as they should be. And what's one of the first responses that you see? Well, there must not be a God, because a God that loves me wouldn't allow for this to happen to me. Well, there must not be a God, because a loving and kind and merciful God would not allow this bad thing to happen unto me. He's trying to get them to understand, you don't know. You don't get it. You don't know what I'm doing. So don't tell me what I'm not doing. So here's old Habakkuk's second complaint. That's bold enough to bring a first complaint. Now here's Habakkuk's second complaint. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are purer eyes than to see evil, cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out of his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offering to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me. and what I will answer, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. One of the most interesting, and I say interesting because it just kind of threw me off guard, lessons that I ever learned was in Panama City, Panama. When we were down, not Florida, the other Panama City, Panama. And one of the most interesting things was we had been to the Panama Canal several times. They had just opened a new part of the Panama Canal. And when we went, we sat through this big, long presentation. And my whole life, everything that I have ever learned about the Panama Canal was that the wonderful, loving government of the United States gave the Panama Canal back to the country of Panama. And then I sit here in that video, and what I'm seeing is a story of how the Panamanians beat the nation of America. How they overthrew America and took the Panama Canal back. And I'm sitting there wondering, what? You know, it's a little bit different story than I had heard before. There's two sides to the coin, okay? What you're witnessing here in this moment is Habakkuk is not understanding where he stands in history. Habakkuk continues to think, just like everyone on the planet, that we're the good guys. We're the ones doing what's right. He doesn't remember the fact that Israel was being punished because of their lack of obedience. Or Israel was being punished because they did not obey the gospel. Same story. Not the gospel, excuse me. The message of God. Same story. Same people. But yet he's sitting there wondering why Israel is being punished. Why is God allowing for these things to happen? Well, because Israel disobeyed God. And as a result, they were to be punished. So what is this second response here? The Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It surely will come, it will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is wide as Sheol, like death. He has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own people, as all peoples. Remember the description given of the Chaldeans? They always looked at everything and could just collect it like it was sand. All the captives were just like specks of sand. All the nations were laughed at. All the borders were scoffed at. The rulers were laughed off. They just would plow through any nation that stood in their way. And so what he's trying to get him to understand is, listen, there's going to come a time when they have to answer for these things too. When they have to understand these things. In fact, in Habakkuk's second complaint, one of the things that he mentions is the people who worship their own dragnets. Meaning they're worshiping their own things. They worship their own selves. Pride. It's this idea of pride. Israel had become prideful. They had become blinded by their own pride. So he makes mention of a few things here. He says in verses 6 through 8, he pronounces, he begins in chapter 2, verse 6, a segment of 5 woes that are pronounced upon them. The first is greed. They're greedy. They're always wanting more. And so you get this pronouncement of woe upon the nation that they need to pay attention to. The second is a financial selfishness. We see this in other places. This is the idea of, I've got enough to take care of me, and even if you don't have enough, well, I've got enough. So it doesn't matter because I'm good. It doesn't matter if you're in pain or in suffering or you don't have enough because I'm okay. I've got enough for myself. The second is slave labor. It's this pressing down and being harder and harder on those who are in service and to you. The third is the irresponsible leaders. This comes to money management and lack of, not necessarily delegation, but lack of proper rulings being put place. And the last is idolatry. All these things the nation has to focus on and fix. And yet they're sitting there complaining about why God is not doing stuff. Well, it gives them a list of woes for them to pay attention to. A list of things that they need to grasp and understand. One thing that we never need to overlook, and one thing we must always pay attention to, is if there is something that is wrong in my life, if there's some relationship that is falling apart, if there's some struggle that is facing, the first person that I need to look at is me. The first person that I need to examine is me. Am I the one causing this problem? Am I the one who's doing this? Now, us being true-blooded Americans, what's our second response? No, it ain't me. It's them. It's somebody else. It's always somebody else. Why? Because we blind ourselves to things. We focus so hard on others, or we put so much pressure on others that we forget that yes, we ourselves can be guilty. We ourselves can be the problem. Something that Israel needed to understand, and something that all the nations in that time period needed to understand, is that the moment that greed was introduced into their heart is the moment that God began to exit. And when God began to exit and completely was separated from them, well, that's when destruction had come. I don't need to tell you how greedy our nation has become. I need to tell you how greedy our people individually have become within this world. We always want more. You think any of these things could be said of us? I always want more. Even if it comes at the cost of somebody else, or even if I have enough, somebody else is struggling, well, I've got enough at least. Maybe not slave labor, but maybe we're harder on those who we have authority over, rather than easier. What about idolatry, irresponsible leaders? All these things could be said about the nation of the United States of America. So that should be what? A little bit of a warning to us maybe, to get things right with our God. There's a few things that I would like for us to look at before we conclude. There's a few moments in Habakkuk's prayer that he makes mention of. And we look at prayers throughout Scripture. Here's a good example of a good prayer for somebody who is struggling with these things, or praying for a nation that might be struggling for these things. Notice this. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of His praises. In the example that was given in the Lord's Prayer, one of the things that is mentioned from the very beginning is this idea of proclaiming the power and might of God. This idea of an exaltation of God before any other thing is said, before any request is made. It's this exalting of God. And this is exactly what is said here by Habakkuk. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of His praise. This is lifting or exalting God. He stood and measured the earth. This is showing His power. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. At the beginning of this book was filled with complaints. Complaints against God, complaints against God's lack of doing something, complaints against God not taking action against these people. And yet right there at the end of the book, Habakkuk's prayer is simple. I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Habakkuk got it by the end. Took him a little bit, but he got it. He understood it. Their problem was that they weren't being patient. They thought that God needed to do this now, on their time, their way, at that moment. And anything less than that means that God did not love or care for them, or God was not all-powerful. And God says, you don't know what's going on. You don't understand what's being prepared. You have no clue what is happening in the grand scheme of things. And so He told them to wait. And so Habakkuk's prayer was plain and simple. I will wait for the day of punishment to come upon those, or the day of judgment to come upon those who invade us. How many of us fall short or fail to wait on God? We think about all those moments where I'm going to go to church one day, or I'm going to get right with God one day, or I'm going to obey the gospel one day. Well, He patiently waits for us, yet sometimes we don't patiently wait for Him. How many of us face times of turmoil or struggle and think, where's God? Why isn't He doing anything? Why is He causing this pain or this suffering to happen to me? Why is this occurring? Where is God when I need Him? You have no clue what God has in store for you. You cannot fathom or understand or begin to comprehend the things that are going on in this world. Yet God does. So that's why He says to have faith. To find comfort in knowing that even if the relief from this pain does not come in this earth, well, there's something that is far better than this earth awaiting for us. Maybe you're here this afternoon and you have been overcome by some of those things, and you begin to question God. Maybe the problem that you're facing right now is you're wondering, where is He when I needed Him? Where was He in that moment of trial or tribulation? Always remember, God has something going on, whether you know it or not. Accept the fact that God is all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing, and knows exactly when we need Him to step in and do something. If you're here this afternoon and need prayers of the church, or need to be added to the Lord's church through baptism, please do not hesitate without leaving here and getting things right with God. Maybe you're looking for that time. Well, here's your time as we stand and as we sing.